All right, I'm going to start just by saying who these wonderful people are to my right who really don't need any introduction, and let them talk briefly about their work, and then we're just going to have kind of an informal conversation. This panel was born out of the fact that my co-chair, Nuala O'Connor, is actually a brand new executive director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and thinking about what people in her position, who have been in her position for a long time, would tell her as she kind of is starting down this path. So directly to my right is Julie Samuels, who is at Engine. Next to her is Sasha Meinrath from XLab, sorry. And then Patrice McDermott from Open the Government. We have one more panelist, Shahid Buttar, from the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, who is currently stuck in traffic, but I am assured that he is on his way. So he may join us in the middle of the panel if he gets able to get here in time. Yeah. So why don't we start with Julie, and you tell us a little bit about Engine, and then we'll move down the line.
So I'm Julie Samuels, and as Amy said, thanks for having us, I should start by saying. This is a great conference, and it's really exciting to be here. I run an organization called Engine. It's actually two organizations, a 501c3 and a C4. So we have Engine Research Foundation and Engine Advocacy. I usually just say Engine for short. But the idea is that we do, traditionally it's been economic research so let me actually take a step back. What Engine does, for those of you who don't know, is works to bridge the gap between policymakers and startups. And so we do a lot of economic research about high growth, high tech entrepreneurism, and we use that to inform our advocacy around some substantive issues, which I can quickly run through if folks are interested. But it's really important to our organization that while the advocacy might help us choose the areas in which we do our research, the research actually inform the advocacy. And it's an interesting thing to do. I mean, I kind of think of us as a government relations shop for startups before they can afford their own government relations shop in a lot of ways. So it leaves us with, it almost feels like two responsibilities. On the one hand, you've got to address these policy issues that startups care about and know they care about. You ask a startup what makes it harder for you to grow your business, and a lot of times that's maybe access to capital or inability to find talent. So then we work on those issues. But there are also issues that I think a lot of startups don't know they need to care about, but it will kind of get them. So we try and pick a mix. One example of the latter is maybe certain areas of copyright law. That's something that can sneak up on a startup. So that's kind of where we're at. I'm happy to talk about anything more in detail, but I don't think this isn't a panel about Engine. This is a panel about being an executive director. But I should say I'm also a new executive director. I've been here, I think I'm only about 3 months maybe. I was on the board of Engine before, but before that I was at EFF. So this world is my world, as it were. And anyway, if anyone does want to talk about Engine substantively, I will be around, and I'm happy to do that, of course. Sasha?
Cool. Yeah, I'm writing down some notes to ponder here. It's so I came to Washington, D.C. in 2007, and I thought that it was going to kind of be a much calmer time of things. I created something called the Open Technology Institute.
You came to DC to be calm?
Yes. Well, so originally I'd come as CEO of a startup company, so I would have been, one of Julie's clients, I'm sure. And that was going to be a really ridiculous kind of, startup. And decided instead I would join this New America Foundation and kind of have a calmer time of things, which of course didn't end up being the case. So I created this Open Technology Institute, having been in DC for about 6 months and realized that there's lots of incredibly smart people, almost all of whom are lawyers, making decisions around technology. And that the technological acumen in this space was near on non-existent. And people were making interesting, I'll say, decisions based upon the best available knowledge, which was usually completely lacking as to the implications of those decisions and rules and regulations and legislation and et cetera. And the original idea was, get 4 to 6 technologists together. So I transitioned out as the director for OTI 3 months ago, with OTI being around 50 people. and about an $8 to $10 million a year organization. So you can imagine year-on-year growth rates of sometimes over 100% from one year to the next. And over the last 7 years, I kind of feel like I learned one key issue, which is that even though many groups are in DC fighting phenomenally hard, doing all the right things, holding the line on today's policy battles across a whole number of different sectors, there's almost no organization, in fact, I don't know of any organization that's thinking, like, what are the battles that we're going to be fighting in 5 years, and how do we prepare the ground for them? So I created the X Lab as kind of this vanguard of technologists that are looking 5 years out. They can still rely on the resources of all these other organizations that we've been working with for years and years in Washington, D.C., including the Open Technology Institute, but are thinking in terms of how do we prepare for what's going to roll down on our heads in 2018, 2020, so that we're not always in this reactive stance in D.C. And that, to me, is a new thing. I'll leave you with kind of 3 elements, I think, that make for a successful starting up of an NGO, which is defining a niche where very few other folks are already in, curating support from people that are going to help launch, provide the seed for that new endeavor, and the third is to build alliances of all these amazing organizations that are in these sectors so that you're not going it alone. I have a very positive sum game assessment of fundraising, of collaborations, et cetera. And I think that network of organizations is what makes for a successful launch of a new organization. So I'll stop there.
Oops. There we go. Hi, I'm Patrice McDermott. I am the executive director of openthegovernment.org. We are a coalition of organizations, about half state-based, but our work is mostly focused here in DC, who work to promote greater openness in the government and to push back on government secrecy. And we are not primarily focused on data, although that's becoming obviously more of a thing, but we work on access to information, records management, FOIA, classified information, all of those sorts of things. I came to openthegovernment.org as director in 2006. We just, the organization of the coalition just celebrated our 10th anniversary. And we were formed out of the depths of the Bush administration in the years after 2001. I don't know if people here remember the massive amounts of information that were taken down off of government websites at that point, and the enormous pushback. The organization I was with at that time, at the time of the attacks, was threatened by the FBI for putting up information. So it was, we grew out of a, somewhat similar to Sasha, but a sense that there were communities in DC who were working on what we call domestic right to know, so EPA issues and labor information and all that sort of thing, and another community that worked on classified information, access there too, pushing back on secrecy at that realm. And they tended not to talk to one another, and often went to the Hill with contradictory messages, which in DC is just about the worst thing that you can do. Because it gives you a unallied face to Hill, but it also confuses members and staff as to what direction they should take, who they should listen to. So anyway, we were formed. We started out with about 30 organizations. It was about 30 when I joined. We're up to pushing 100 now, and are involved in all sorts of things. You had asked Amy to talk about what our advice to NULA would be, and we can get to that. But, you know, I think there are real challenges. A coalition certainly has challenges in terms of fundraising and not being in competition with your partners for the same sources of funding. It's a very, very sensitive issue that occasionally raises its ugly head. So I think that's, of course, CDT is not a coalition. But that is a real challenge, and there's a lot of groups that start out thinking of working in coalition, and there's a lot of landmines there, and a lot of work with funders that has to be done to make sure they understand the relationships among all the various partners, and that what the relationship is between a coalition and the work that individual organizations do, and how they work together, and how they where they overlap, where they don't overlap, where there's not conflict. So I'll stop there too, and we can then go back.
All right, so as I said, I started talking about NULA. We really thought about this panel quite carefully. And we're like, who are a lot of different people who are at a lot of different points, who have kind of entered this career path. But as Julie said, she's brand new. Sasha is transitioning, has been in the executive role for a while and is now in the executive role at a new organization. And Patrice has been around and helped her organization grow. And I think those are all really, really fantastic places to be. And they each afford new opportunities. So I'm hoping this will just be a conversation, and feel free to pipe in and to talk back and forth and not rely on me. I'm just here for decoration. And Sasha and Patrice, you both kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested if you'll start talking about what are the greatest challenges that you found in the job and what opportunities you've been able to glean from those challenges.
Well, I think personally, for me, the biggest challenge as an executive director is I came into this area because I was interested in the issues. And I liked working on issues, records management, how wonky can you get? But, and as an organization grows and becomes successful, at least in my experience and other people I've spoken to, the opportunity to actually engage in the issues disappears because there is so much day-to-day administration, management, development, keeping, proofreading, copy editing, all of that has to be done on it's a quotidian sort of thing, and it really eats up your attention space. And that is a challenge and a frustration. So it's, the opportunity really is to bring new people along and to open up opportunities for staff to step in and develop their skills and to move forward. But it's difficult. It's not necessarily fun. The fun part of the job can sometimes disappear.
So I'll give sort of four pieces of advice for folks that are doing this. The first is probably the most important, which is to liberate your staff. You should always hire people that are smarter than you are. And if you're not doing that, you're a sucky manager. So like if you were here for the prior panel, you heard Tim and Danielle talking about stuff that like I have a surface gleaning of, but their knowledge on these areas is staggering. And I want all of the members of my team to have that kind of capacity. So if somebody's part of my organization, but they're not stunning in some facet of what they're doing, I'm going to transition them out. I also think, especially as an organization kind of grows and kind of becomes a little bit better established, this notion of keeping things very simple. It's so easy to create processes and procedures that kind of ossify the organization. And I think whereas a small amount of that may be necessary, the vast super majority of these things often I think are counterproductive. And it always makes me bonkers to see, for all the right reasons, additional protocols and procedures put in place that end up kind of binding our hands and preventing us from actually being able to do really interesting things. The third, and I'm glad we're not broadcasting because I'm going to say it, build your fuck you fund. Streaming, but not broadcasting. But this is, I think, fundamentally important. If you are successful, there will inevitably come that day where you want to do something and one of your funders, because you've got a nice diversified portfolio, is like, we don't want you to do that. And it's probable that you could still do that. You certainly can still do that if you have funding in the bank that can get you through without that funder. And again, it's about liberating yourself to pursue the vision and mission of the organization, regardless of the vagaries of a particular funding source or political, pragmatic, et cetera. And I think that almost nobody does that, right? We are so bad at building up some sort of rainy day, fuck you reserve. And I think it really differentiates organizations that are able to, and this is the fourth element, maintain risk tolerance over time, and those that kind of get bound down and become sort of a little less radical, a little less progressive, a little bit less of pushing the envelopes on things. And it's so hard to do because in the immediacy, there's always a reason to make a decision that just has a tiny opportunity cost. But if you add those kinds of decisions up over time, you end up being a very different organization than the original vision.
So, I'm just actually going to comment on a couple things that you guys said, and I think I have a fairly interesting perspective because I was lucky to come to Engine from EFF, which is an incredibly well-run organization. And I was on the board of Engine before, and whenever I would go to board meetings, and now that I'm running it, I would always try and infuse it with these lessons learned from EFF, which, if you want to talk about a successful NGO, EFF is example 1A. And I feel really, really lucky for that. And when you talk about liberating your employees, that is by far and away the most important thing. And it's not just setting people free it's to work on what they want to work on. It's to have a life they want to have, particularly because, you're asking people, and I'm in San Francisco, Engine's based in San Francisco. We're asking people to make a fraction of what they would make if they went to work for a startup right now, even a startup in potentially a policy shop. So, you're really asking you have to find people who want to do it, and then you have to make it worth it for them. I remember when I first left the law firm and came to EFF, and something happened, and I was able to bring my dog to work, and there were all these funny things like that. And at one point it was like, well, if this doesn't work out, we'll change offices because we want you to be happy. And I was like, oh, that's why this is going to work out. That's why this is going to work out. And I always felt really supported to do the work I wanted to do. So that is, I think, crucial to running a good organization because you need good people, you need smart people, and you need people who want to be there.
And to work for less wages.
And work for significantly less wages in incredibly expensive cities. It's actually the worst of both worlds like that. But if you make it fun and worth their while and that they can see a future, also what I find is that particularly there's a lot of turnover, which is normal at the lower end. More junior, the more junior people, younger people come in, they leave to go to grad school. That's just part of the cycle, and that's okay. Because I actually worked at nonprofits, too, before I went to law school. I did that, and it worked out pretty well for me. So I really want to, I think one of the best responsibilities we have in running NGOs is kind of creating armies of people who believe what we believe. And I think that's really important in putting them out there in the world. And some of them are eventually going to have to make more money. Or some of them eventually are going to have to move cities or do something different or go into private practice or whatever. And that's fine, but you've indoctrinated them first, hopefully, with everything that is right in the world. And that's really something that I think is not just important to me, but should be important to every organization. The funding piece is something else I wanted to talk about, and we should probably have a whole conversation about funding, because as I've quickly learned, that's basically my job now. And it has to be the most important thing. Because without that, you can't do anything, right? So diversity of fundraising is one of my primary goals for a lot of the reasons you talk about. And when you talk about having the Fuck You Fund, which I think is a lovely way to put it, and I'm going to borrow that from you if you don't mind, the way I've found thus far to try and do that is I try and do most of my fundraising project-based, so that, if you end up doing something that pisses someone else off, you can be like, you're still going to piss people off, but at least you can be like, no, but you funded this piece of our work. And then I'm trying to do it more that way, just to kind of insulate myself or insulate the organization a bit. But it's hard, and it's really hard from our perspective because, of course, we're supposed to be representing startups who have no money. So I have to convince people that it's in your benefit to support the startups. And I think most people get that you want to pay it forward, but I worry all the time. Like right now in the world in which we do our work, the economy is pretty good. There's money flowing right now. I'd be curious. I mean, you guys were around when there wasn't money flowing, and it's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, and certainly for us, it ebbs and flows. And I'd be curious to know for each of your situations if, we're a project of another C3. We're not our own C3. So I don't have a board, I have a steering committee. But do your boards do fundraising work for you as well? Because a few people on mine do. But that's, I think, a real problem for most NGOs is that your board members are there because they believe in what you're doing and blah, blah, blah. But they also, in my case, they all run their own nonprofits, or they're involved in their own nonprofits as well. So they're like that tension I mentioned. But with ours, fundraising was easy during the Bush administration. And then at the beginning of the Obama administration, it got really scary because funders thought, problem done, it's over, everything's going to be taken care of. And it took about 6 months for that to become apparent that no, that's not the case. But our problem is, again, because we're a coalition, and because funders, we get mostly general support, which actually I much prefer. But more and more funders have a time limit on how long they will fund you. And, we're coming up against those. And in this area, there's a tiny little world of funders who do this. And, we're trying to start thinking now about individual donors, but that's an entirely new realm of things. So it's really mixed. We have money to work on Open Government Partnership, which is this multilateral thing that Obama launched in 2011. It's a multinational thing with impacts here in DC. But we've got, 2 years of money for that, which was this huge jump they gave us through a lot of money out of a couple different organizations, our different funders, and we're under pressure to grow because of the things that they want done. But then what do you do when that money goes away, and it goes away in 2 years? I don't like the idea of people being dependent on me when I don't think I'm going to be able to keep paying them a salary.
At EFF, we did some interesting things. They did some interesting things about that because it's a really big problem when you start getting a lot of money. People are giving you money to do more of the work you're doing, but you also want to hire people if you're not sure if that money is going to stick around. That's a really hard place to find yourself in. Some of the stuff that EFF has done, that I hope one day I'm in a position to do at Engine, is there were more employee perks. Some things that were substantial, some things that weren't, like we had a masseuse come in once a week. But things to keep the employees there, to keep the employees happy, especially because at the same time that we were getting a lot more money, there were also a lot more high-paying jobs for, any of us could have left and gone somewhere. So I thought what they did that was really smart was the organization. I mean, they also hired, but in an effort to hire smartly, use that extra funding to keep people happy in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have anything in particular to add. I will say, though, fundraising, I think a lot of people, there's a singular problem that has shown up again and again and again and again in this space that I see from leadership in this space, which is that all fundraising is not created equal. And I see people doing fundraising that is actually community building and thinking that what they're doing is capital raising. And it's two totally different strategies. Both are critically important. But for the most part, community building events are there to have people have a good time and to kind of activate your base and to build alliances and create opportunities for brainstorming and conspiring and et cetera. And it's a totally different thing. It's often, in fact, much more intensive to do community building fundraising events than it is to do the kind of big capital fundraising endeavors. Like grant writing is a big one. I think salon dinners and patron fundraising. It's, for me personally, there's something about having a series of conversations and walking away with a $500,000 check to spend on anything you want that is completely different than having a bake sale or a happy hour or any of these other things, which are great. They may raise a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of dollars, maybe. But in essence, it's a totally different thing. And on the kind of patron grant writing, et cetera, I'd say that's where our work is so singularly important. We often hold the relationships in a lot of that. But on the community building, it's something where the whole organization is involved and where it's like you want the staff to be actively engaged in that because they're the ones that have those connections and will actually carry that forward over time.
I try and think of that when I'm looking for the big checks, that's the sustainable money, and those smaller community building things, it's A, community building, and B, lets us do more on the edges. Like the extra, maybe we produce a video or a thing that we couldn't otherwise do. But the thing about fundraising that I found the thing about this job in general that I found so interesting is it's the most social job I've ever had. I do not have a minute where, unless I'm proofreading something, which is less and less frequently, unfortunately, I have very, very little time where I'm not talking to somebody. And I'm a really social, extroverted person, so for me, that's fine. And we have, events a lot of nights, and that's fine because that's probably what I'd be doing anyway. But it's once a weekend, I take my dog on a 2-hour walk, and that is the only time all week when I'm not asleep that I'm not working and not talking to somebody. And half the time I'm on the phone to my parents because they're like, "Where have you been all week? Why haven't you talked to us?" So that's been really a very interesting thing for me. It's the most social job, and there's very little time, unless it's directly related to fundraising, where you get to do substantive work. And maybe this is because I'm a lawyer by trade, so I'm used to having a lot of, even I was a litigator in a former life, and I've been on trial, working 20-hour days. But even in those times, I had time set aside to dive into something, to read a brief, to write a brief, to do legal research. That's gone from my schedule. Yeah. If I want to spend time thinking deeply about something, it's at 10 o'clock at night, or like 5 in the morning. That's the only time I get free anymore.
Yeah.
Is it going to stay like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Last year, we do a report every year. It's called the Secrecy Report. And it really takes and looks at trends in government statistics over time. But we had been reporting on the government's reports on national security letters and how they were being used. And then, of course, Snowden blew everything up. And in order for, I felt a need to step back before we did this report and figure out what the hell we knew and didn't know now. And it took me, I had to work from home for starters. And it took me the better part 3 weeks, a month to carve out the time to focus and just think and work through. So yeah, that's one of the painful learnings.
To that I'll add, I feel like a lot of the ethos of an organization kind of flows from how people at the top act and are. I bring like my daughter to a lot of work events because I'm just like, oh, there's no way I'm not spending time with her. And that makes me, I guess, to some antisocial because I'm playing with her. On the other hand, it's like, and she's often kind of the unofficial mascot for whatever event or convening or what have you. But to me, it's also about, like, you set rules, you create a culture, you create a space whereby, it can be, and in fact, the job often is pulling you in 8 different directions at once in a way that is psychosis-inducing. And it's kind of like one of the roles or responsibilities is to figure out how to, like, keep things relatively sane, given that there's always something else that you could do that will benefit your organization, that will pay off, that will help your own expense, right? And that balance is always talked about, very difficult to achieve.
The other piece that's been funny for me is that I've always been a lawyer. And people ask what you do. Oh, I'm a lawyer. And now all of a sudden people ask what I do, and it's like, I know how to answer it, but I don't know how to answer it quickly.
Right.
And I feel like I lost a little, more than other job changes, and I've changed jobs many times in my life, this one felt like a new identity in a different way than any other job change has felt, and that's been really interesting. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Actually,
Oh, we have a new panelist.
we got joined by our final panelist.
In spite of traffic, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Shahid Buttar from the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Why don't we interrupt your thought for just a second and let you give some background on your organization and what you do. And they were just talking, I had posed to them what are the greatest challenges and the greatest opportunities with running an organization, and they're doing really well discussing this.
Got
So
it.
I'm going to punt it to you, and I'm going to pass the mic your way.
Thank you, Amy. And I run the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. We were founded to fight the Patriot Act shortly after its introduction about 12 years ago. We're a grassroots organizing network. We were founded out of a progressive peace and justice response to the Bush administration's assault on the Constitution, and remain very much at it despite the partisan inversion of interests in some respects. So our base is relatively equal parts libertarian and progressive. Since 2009, we've particularly worked on organizing across different faith and demographic communities by presenting the surveillance state to different communities in the terms most relevant to them. So it looks very different in different places, right? But in low-income communities of color, the surveillance state is quite frankly nothing new. And the NSA is the least of the problems in those places. So connecting the dots and building a movement that connects the various abuses of policing and intelligence agencies is our mission. I joined the organization in 2009, 8 years into its founding, to replace the founding director. I'd come from a policy background. I did a little impact litigation straight out of law school, marriage equality and campaign finance reform. I was the communications director at the American Constitution Society for a while, and then I had a chance to sue the FBI on a FOIA theory, investigating the essentially secret policy governing undercover infiltration of activist groups and faith communities. So that led me to BORDC 5 years ago. And in terms of the challenges and opportunities of running an organization, I'd say, one of the challenges is the perpetual limitation of resources and trying to execute visions that are impossible. My mandate is to dismantle the national security state, and it's like I have 2 organizers and a communications person, it's like there's no way. We are so infinitesimally dwarfed by the institutions that we confront, and that's, challenging. I'd say one of the opportunities, though, is to mobilize people in the service of addressing that, and one of the inspiring things for me to see every day, there are a lot of organizations whose model is sort of, pay smart lawyers to do things, and, that'll work in a very linear way. Organizing, the reason I organize instead of impact lit, and I do policy too, but, the reason that organizing to me is very compelling is because it's the opportunity to build a long tail in a movement, because it's when beauticians, carpenters, students, stay-at-home moms are engaged, like the 16-year-old who's blowing up on YouTube and Twitter for making Pelosi reveal herself to be a fool on NSA spying. Check it out if you haven't seen it. Google 16-year-old Pelosi. It's amazing. It's great. That's the kind of stuff that shifts wins, right? And yes, we're a plaintiff in a case against the NSA, but that kind of stuff to me isn't quite as compelling. And the opportunity is to engage people. For me, the opportunity has been to engage people in the service of their own activism and their own organizing, finding some way for each person to help build the movement in whatever capacities and skills and resources are available to them. Was that? Yeah, okay. Was that in the zone?
That's all in the zone. And Julie, you had just made a point about litigation.
Describing yourself.
Oh, no, it's about describing
Yeah.
who I am and what I do now. So I was at EFF before, now I run an organization.
Oh, right on.
And I was saying before you walked up that I'm not a lawyer, really. I mean, I'm technically still a lawyer, but
What you do.
it's not what I do. And actually, I don't have malpractice insurance anymore, so I'm not even sure I can do it at all. But it's like this funny shift at like when someone asks what you do. It's like, well, I run an organization that, particularly when I go home, I'm from Chicago, so when I go home, it's to people who aren't really, when I'm in DC, it's incredibly easy to explain what I do. But when I'm, with my family and friends from growing up, and it's like, what do you do? It's like, I actually don't know what I do. And that's kind of where we
I do
where
this,
we
I
were.
mime this,
Yeah.
and that, and this,
Exactly.
and that, and then this.
But it's usually that,
stuck
like,
in
at
my
the same
phone.
time. It's like.
Yeah, exactly, right.
I've always been a policy wonk, so it's, I do, say, I coordinate policy wonks, you know?
It's around describing ourselves.
And your organization and kind of where you're coming from this at. And I'm going to just throw another big picture question to the entire panel for you guys to talk about. And that's as a new employee at a nonprofit organization, how does that process work for you? You talk about hiring really smart people, but what do you look for? What do you try to pursue in your employees? And at what point do you know that something is really going to work out? Like, what are the good qualities that you see when you're working around people every single day?
I think in this work in general, the most important quality is that someone can be a self-starter. Because, I mean, that sounds kind of trite, but as someone who's also worked at a law firm, there's so much structure there that even if you're not a self-starter, someone will eventually tell you what to do. But I don't have the resources or the time to tell someone what to do. It's just, I don't have that extra time in my day to micromanage anyone, and I don't think anyone does, yeah.
No, my experience has been that I need people who I can throw them into something and they can figure it out, or they have enough self-presence and self-awareness to know to come and ask. But a self-starter and somebody who's willing to contribute to the organization in whatever form, to be able to identify what needs to be done and bring it to me if you know, I'm not seeing it. But yeah, just to contribute to the whole at their own initiative.
And I would even add to that, more than in other areas, I find that even large organizations have a very, what I now call, startup mentality. And, you know, I worked for a very small nonprofit before law school, and, you know, one day my boss was like, "Can you fix the doorbell?" And that was one step too far. I was like, "I'm sorry, I cannot fix the doorbell." But I was definitely like standing on ladders, changing fluorescent light bulbs, and, you know, and that's what you did. I mean, it's just,
Totally.
and it still feels that way, even with, I have more resources at this organization than we did then, but there's nothing, you can't be too good for anything.
No. The other thing that I really need is people who can write, at least write decently, if not really well.
Do you guys find on this, I mean, I was just going to chime in, I think, yeah, self-starting, an initiative and a passion for the work, but on the writing piece, do you see the sophistication of our civilization declining before your eyes? Is that just me? I mean, really, it's like falling apart at the seams. You know, I mean, there are still good writers out there, but like it's, you know, I was just talking, we're going through a hiring process now, and really talented people.
It's hard to find.
Yeah. Yeah, even people who are very talented in lots of different dimensions. You know, writing as a talent in our culture is really, not even remotely.
Really quickly, it's a lot easier to find policy people in San Francisco because there aren't that many policy jobs. So we are in a hiring process right now, and I cannot believe the amazing resumes I got and the ones I didn't even call back. And it's because there aren't that many policy jobs where I live. So if you guys want to put offices in other places, it will increase your talent pool immensely.
Yeah, I'll just add, I tend to look for folks that have sort of a certain generosity of spirit, sort of an empathy, compassion, with just a hint of arrogance. And the reason for that is actually, it takes, I think, a little bit of willful obtuseness to fight a lot of the battles that we fight. Like, no one in their right mind would walk into Washington, D.C. and say, I'm going to change this space. But you need to have a notion, not only that that's possible, but you're going to be the person to do it. And so I'd say most of the time that actually ends up working out. That the collaborative spirit, the empathy kind of puts a little bit of a blunt or a bluntness or undermines the arrogance that otherwise runs amok. But that both of those elements are very key for the kinds of people that I'm looking for. Collaborators that are going to become leaders.
Is there a point in time when the arrogance goes away based on how long they've been at the job and it's replaced by anything else?
I would say the best people are definitely increasingly humbled as we realize just how complicated these sorts of things are, for sure. That may not be perceived from the outside. I think, part of our job is actually to project certainty and gregariousness and et cetera, even when internally we're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And so that's just like the role that we have to play. But certainly I think the best leaders are out there saying, like, man, the talents in this room far dwarf me. And they're not saying that, they're meaning that and internalizing that.
Totally. And to that point, I mean, going back a little bit to, I can't recall exactly the precise context, but this idea of always the opportunities. The opportunity to mold an organizational culture around whatever set of norms and principles you're attached to. And so, we run relatively horizontally, and that's something that, as a process commitment, burns a little bit of time, but seems to entail a very different sort of institutional culture. And I found that to be really compelling. And in this piece here, we were talking about the way that we relate to and inspire and mentor and motivate and coach and guide our colleagues. Those present, I think, really fun opportunities.
I'd also make a point there that it's important to think about this, which I think we're all talking about, as an ecosystem, and that you do, I think, tend to find burnout in organizations, people who've been working on an issue and in some instances losing and working on an issue for many years, and then a new organization or new people come in, and that brings new energies, new oxygen to the room, and that's okay. Like, this is a really big ecosystem. And again, this is something that I said this at the beginning, and I'll say it again, but something that EFF has been so amazing at is there are so many people who've worked at EFF who are now in other organizations. I mean, when I think even about me going to Engine, like, an organization that represents startups could have ended up with someone really, really different ideologically from me. And I think it's better for the world that it's someone who worked at EFF first, because I come at it from a certain worldview, and that's really, I think that at the end of the day, I actually think that is one of the most important things in an organization, a successful organization can do.
Turning out a cadre of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like,
Right. Now, I think, actually, I take a little different approach than Sasha in terms of, we're not that big an organization, but this comes from where I've worked before, but bringing on relatively new, young people that you see talent in, you see the ability, but not necessarily that arrogance, and because the issues that we all work on are very complex, and you don't want somebody to be overwhelmed by that complexity, but you also want them to understand that they're not simple. There are solutions, there are things you can change, but they're all part of a complex ecosystem, and you just can't step in and blow it up. If you want to be effective over time, yes, you can step. But if you want to be part of the Washington ecosystem, then you have to learn how to play well with others. You have to learn who the players are. You have to get to know them. You have to establish your bona fides. There is a whole process, and I like to see the self-confidence and even to some extent a little arrogance develop over time based on expertise, based on real knowledge and a sense of being respected by peers for what you know and how you comport yourself and how you do what you do. So yes, I can understand the appeal of that, but I'd like to see that develop. And then eventually you get humbled again. So,
Is it fair, Patrice, to draw a distinction between deference to, and I would agree entirely with respect to like intra-coalition,
right,
sort of like politics.
Right.
But then I also see that sometimes in DC taken to also inculcate a deference to institutions that quite
right.
frankly should take a little more heat.
Right.
And there's the inside-outside
Right.
tension,
No.
groups that have different positions
boy,
relative to
that's a huge one for us because we work both with the government and at the government, as I say, and it really is a dance. There are things like this Open Government Partnership and some other things where we are working hand in hand with the White House. And it is, and we try not to be deferential, and we try to keep, my colleagues, I try to push them to, even though they're friends with people in the White House, not to cut them slack, to push them just as hard as they would anybody else. But yeah, no, it is hard, and it's the same thing on the Hill. You don't want to alienate your one or two people that you can go to on the Hill that are going to do anything for you. But it's also the role of our coalition and the role, I think, of the community generally to push back. So, but I think like a really good example that I don't know how many of you watched Harley Geiger of CDT testify at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He trod that line beautifully. He was respectful, not deferential, but respectful, or deferential to the extent that, you defer to the authority of the person, you recognize that, but push back without being obnoxious, without being hostile, without evoking a really strong negative reaction from the committee, which is, you really don't want to do. So, I think it's a delicate line, and it's a dance a lot of times. And, we have partners who in meetings have pushed too hard, been personally rude, and been excluded from meetings thenceforth, which, may have been satisfying. But, so no, it's a very hard line, and it's a hard line for people to learn.
So we have actually about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So I'm going to let everybody do the last comments. But for my last question, just to have answered, it would be, what is the one thing you are most proud of learning? And what is the one thing you haven't figured out yet?
So I think for me, the thing I've been proud of learning, and probably the thing in which I'm least interested in the abstract but recognize the necessity of, and that's why I'm proud of having learned it, is fundraising. And reconceptualizing it from at the outset as asking people for money to understanding it as inviting people to engage in something and be a part of something bigger themselves. That was a paradigm shift for me that took, especially coming from a background where I wasn't necessarily awash in resources. It took me a while to get to that perspective and understand it through that lens. And so I'm proud of that. I think the thing I probably haven't figured out yet is how not to burn people out. Mm-hmm. That's a struggle, and I throw a lot at people on my team, and we all sort of slog through it. But occasionally, it seems that I burn people out, and that's something I'd like to work on and get a better handle on.
To answer, I'm going to take them backwards, because the thing that's incredibly hard for me, it's part of burning people out, but it's learning to say no. And I've always had a hard time had a hard time saying no about myself, but now it implicates a lot of other people and their lives when I can't say no. And so I need to readdress that, and it's really hard. For instance, I gave the staff, we closed the office Friday afternoons for the summer. In one of these efforts to make it an attractive place to work. Right. But I'm always working, and I'm like emailing people, and then they're not responding, and that's totally messed up. Like, I shouldn't do that, but that's really hard. I think that might be a management skill across the board, but I think it's particularly acute in the NGO world. I don't know if I've been doing this long enough to really speak persuasively about what I'm most excited at having learned. Ask me next year, I'll come back. But I will say, what I've found the most fun, let me say that, because what's been really fun for me about this job is that I really believe in what we're doing. And because I really believe in what we're doing, I think I'm doing a pretty good job. And whether it be fundraising or coalition building or whatever piece of this as ED that I need to tackle, I'm really excited to talk about the work we're doing. I feel like it's important. I feel like it's meaningful. And it actually makes the whole thing a lot more fun. Right. Again, I feel like money's flowing right now generally, so I recognize this will be different when and if the economy changes again. But I feel like it's very lucky to be able to do what you love for a living. And I think the thing that I try and keep with me, and that I will continue to try and keep with me, is to not lose sight of that.
Sure. So I'd say I'm definitely most proud of, in many ways, learning to let go. And that's the small things where in an organization, power always is accruing up. No matter how much we talk about it, it takes a concerted effort to maintain a distribution of that power and roles and responsibilities. And this is particularly acute, I think, for the folks that are running these organizations, in that you know that one thing you could do better, or at least you've convinced yourself that you could do it better. But in fact, the letting go of those things, the delegation, the constantly asking yourself, how do I move this from my plate to somebody else's plate? Because you've got an infinite to-do list, is crucial. And the second component of that is learning to let go of the organization itself. Right? Mortality still holding steady at 100%. You will not be in charge of this organization at some point. And the question is, how do you define the parameters over how you want that transition to look? And that should be something that's part of a plan that is playing out over the course of you building that organization, and that gets executed upon as much as possible on your own terms. The second part, the thing that I'm still trying to figure out, is this notion of how to best implement a 25-year plan. I feel like a lot of folks that end up on the other side of the table from me on a lot of different issues are better resourced. They often are thinking strategically and over a much longer time horizon. And so I was like, well, what we need is really a progressive, radical, 25-year intervention schema. And so for the past 3 years, I've been developing that with a small group of folks. I was talking with a really good friend of mine, Josh Breitbart, and he's like, well, actually, you're 10 years into a 35-year plan. But the notion of we have to change the mechanisms by which we are trying to reform a lot of these endeavors, not to be about this year, next year, 3 years from now, but over a longer time horizon. And that necessitates a certain level of holding one another accountable that we are really bad at. People continually make horrendously stupid strategic decisions, and there's never a discussion. This isn't to like bang people over the head. This is really to say, like, who's got strategic acumen in this space that's proven itself out over a longer period of time, and who tends to maybe not be, that might not be their strong suit. And identifying that and figuring that out and talking to funders in order to get not the 1-year grant or the 2-year grant, but commitments over time. Those are the kinds of institutional shifts that have to happen if we're going to win these battles over the long term. And I haven't yet figured out how to do that, but I'm certainly interested in the kinds of conversations that might help with that.
So what I'm most proud of, I guess it's two things. One is not growing the organization, the coalition in size necessarily, although I think that's useful and important, but expanding the influence and the awareness of the coalition and the work we do and the issues that we work on. And the other thing is that what is her title? Assistant director, I think she chose, is now moving into her own as a leader in the world of the Freedom of Information Act, and letting her go, giving her the support she needs. I'm proud that in the 6 years I've been there, 8 years almost, that she's grown into that and come into her own. The thing that I have the hardest time with is, it's like Julie and everybody else, is I make sure my colleagues take vacation and that they take time off and blah, blah, blah. But, even when I'm on vacation, I'm still checking the email and still responding. And it's partly because they're still asking me my advice on stuff, which, I need to wean them off that. Maybe just by not responding. But it's very hard to step away. We're a very small organization. We're at 5 now. We were 2 and then 3 for a long time. So separating out from it. And I think your point about, you know, a sort of transition, thinking that through, I mean, I'm much closer to that point than anybody else on this panel. And it's, you know, it is hard to think about, not making sure that the organization is in a position financially and otherwise to carry on, and that there is the time and the space to do that transition in a good and useful way. But yeah, that's hard. And into the 25-year plan, people in this community have been struggling with that, for the other side being so much better funded and organized, and having persistent funders who took a long view. And whereas the folks in our community, at least in the policy side, tend to change their priorities from every few years. So, yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and I hope
Shahid?
the room will. Oh,
okay, yeah.
you started, right?
I did, yeah.
Okay. I hope the room will join me in thanking our panel, and we're going to transition to the next. Thank you so much.
Thank you.